Here we go. Okay. Good evening and welcome to the Prince George's County Historical Society's July 31st, 2023 History Chat. I'm Donna Schneider, president of the Society. Tonight we will find out, are dinosaurs historic? What are dinosaurs? Where do we find them? Do they live in Prince George's County? Do they need preservation? Host John Peter Thompson and JP Hodnett we'll discuss these and other questions as they chat about Prince George's County's Dinosaur Park here in Laurel, Maryland. We will be recording this chat, so please mute your microphones. We will have a Q&A, so please put your questions in the chat box and we will answer them after the chat. A little something about our guest tonight. JP Hodnett is the paleontologist and program coordinator for the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission's Dinosaur Park, as well as a paleontologist for the National Park Service Geological Resource Division's paleontology program. He received his bachelor's degree in biology from Northern Arizona University and his master's degree in biology from St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. His primary research interests are in the evolution and ecology of Paleozoic to early Mesozoic sharks and Cenozoic mammalian carnivores. JP has conducted paleontological field work in Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Wyoming, Ohio, Kentucky, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and Maryland. So, John Peter, it's now your turn.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you everybody for joining us. And JP, it looks like there are two JPs tonight. As a lay historian, I'm always interested in digging for history. So this is going to be a great evening because we're going to dig further down than I usually go. And I'm glad you're here because I have a burning question to start us off with. Are dinosaurs historic?
All right, thanks, John. I guess if you put in the context, are dinosaurs historic life forms? Then the short answer is absolutely. In terms of people's history, well, dinosaurs actually have a strong tie to our own persons of the past, you would say. There's actually been some work to suggest that fossils, and we can talk briefly about what a fossil is, but fossils in general may have been inspiring what a lot of our human myths might have originated from. Things from the Cyclops, griffins, and things like that may have been inspired by ancient life forms. So, for example, like the Cyclops skull may have actually been a mammoth skull. People always confuse that the nasal hole was maybe the eye socket for a Cyclops was actually for the trunk of an elephant. The griffin may have been inspired by dinosaur fossils found in the Middle East and Gobi areas of Asia. So, and then of course there's always the human pursuit of trying to find, what life was like in the past. And of course that established the science of paleontology, which is generally the science of studying ancient life forms, not necessarily, ancient peoples.
I suppose we'll get what is a fossil out of the way right up front here.
Okay, so a fossil is essentially any evidence of ancient life. So different types of fossils you can think of. Well, the most classic one, and every time I ask a child, what is a fossil? A dinosaur bone. So bones of ancient animals is usually the first thing most people come to mind. Other things could be, the impression of leaves. The actual physical body fossil impression of an insect or something that's entrapped in like petrified sap called amber. Footprints of animals is another type of fossil. So as we call those trace fossils, the evidence of things that weren't so alive were kind of left behind in the area, like footprints. Poop, for example, can be a fossil. Eggs, necessarily not part of the body of the ancient critter, but those are just examples of evidence of those things being in our region at one point or another.
So when we put a subdivision in and we find some animal bones, are those bones fossils?
Well, so there's a little bit maybe more to it. So one of my colleagues once told me, he's like, a fossil is anything a paleontologist studies. But some people will put a time caveat on that. Usually some people want to put the cutoff around 10,000 years, and anything, older than 10,000 years is potentially a fossil. I depends on what you want to talk about. Because some people have done work on extinct birds from the Hawaiian Islands, and they're finding their remains. Now, these are the physical body portions of these birds, but they're, you know, a couple hundred years old, but they sometimes are considered fossils because they are, again, the evidence of the ancient life that used to be there, the life of the past. But they're not something that's been either altered by people or created by people. So again, they're part of the natural element of the environment there from the past.
And one more sort of generic question, and I think when Donna read some of our questions, are they alive in Prince George's County today? Present tense?
Present tense. Yes, I would absolutely argue, and a lot of my colleagues would argue that dinosaurs are still alive today. We just give them a different name now. We call them birds. So we actually can trace back the origin of birds from a dinosaur ancestor. Some at least 150 or so million years, give or take. The most classic example is an animal called Archaeopteryx, which originally was found by a single feather in, I believe, in like the early 1800s in the Bavarian region. And then soon afterward, a partial body was found. And then after that, another body was found, but almost in its entirety. And basically, it showed a creature that had a long tail like a lizard, a head that was slightly birdish, but it had teeth in the jaws, and then wings, full-on wings with feathers. But at the end of the wings were claws. And there's a lot of studies that have been done recently on this animal. This suggests that this animal was capable of at least a decent powered flight. And then the reason why it had powered flight is it actually lived on a chain of islands, which is now pretty much Germany to this day.
So Prince George's County has dinosaurs. Well, let me zero in. Usually when I think of dinosaurs, I think of the Smithsonian, and it probably has a different name, to Tyrannosaurus Rex, you know, or Jurassic Park. I know those aren't alive in Prince George's, but can we find in the sort of the same time that the Tyrannosaurus was running around, is there like a dinosaur park or someplace one can go and look for dinosaur fossils?
Thanks, John. That's a great lead-in. Why, yes, you can come visit Dinosaur Park in Laurel, Maryland, where we do have the remains of dinosaurs. If you don't mind, I can share a quick slideshow of some of the things that we have found. Just going to give you kind of a taste of what we usually work with, and a little bit kind of the history that's happening, and a little bit of our future as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and pull up my little short PowerPoint. And hopefully this will go down. Aha, here's our glorious logo of our Maryland National Capitals Parks and Planning Commission Dinosaur Park. Again, right outside of Laurel, Maryland. Anyway, so essentially what Dinosaur Park is, we are a small kind of 3-acre park region tucked behind some business warehouses. And I would like to point out that we were there before the warehouses. We're at the end of Mid-Atlantic Boulevard near Conti Road, which is also not far from Route 1. This park was established to basically protect the remaining fossil resources that was essentially left of what was essentially a almost century-long mining operation. The history of the area, it used to be back in the 1800s, the area was a iron mine. A lot of the key rocks that are actually still preserved in the park, we find ironstones, which are rich in iron minerals. But then afterwards, let's say about the turn of the century, the region was switched into clay mining, which was actually the dominant bedrock of that area. And these clays and ironstones are what contain a lot of the fossils. These fossils date back to 115 million years ago, what we call the early Cretaceous period. To put that in perspective, everybody loves Tyrannosaurus Rex. Tyrannosaurus Rex lived approximately 78 to 66 million years ago at the end of the Cretaceous period, or the late Cretaceous. And so our fossils are roughly 50 million years older than Tyrannosaurus Rex. So everything you find at our park are pre-T-Rex dinosaurs, essentially. Just to give you kind of an idea of some of the few things we find, this is a quick example. So I have at least 4 fossils and 2 reconstructions in this picture. In the upper left-hand corner, the swirly rock-looking object is actually a early snail. We do get invertebrate or non-backbone animal fossils at our park. They're not as common, say, compared to some of our dinosaurs, but we do have them, and they are very important environmental indicators. And from our clams and our snails and some of our fishes, the predominantly environment of our area was essentially a freshwater river. And I'll show you a reconstruction of that in a moment. But from these kind of important fossils, you know, we can give a lot more detail in terms of like what the environment was like. The lower right-hand picture is a weird blackish blob. What that is actually a trunk of a carbonized tree. And it's not petrified wood per se, which is a classic term people like to use on fossil plants. This is wood that's been squished for millions and millions of years, just shy of turning into coal, or more specifically, a term we use is called lignite or brown coal. And there's scores of these ancient logs that come eroding out of our hill every year. And these kinds of fossils, you know, because of their condition, they quickly erode as soon as they get exposed to the surface, and they just fall to pieces. And these are kind of things that our visitors will stumble across, sometimes quite literally, every time they come out. And so the most dominant fossils we find at our park are not necessarily dinosaur bones, but plant remains. Lots of evidence of trees and other types of plants. But of course, we do have dinosaurs. And up until fairly recently, most of the things we would find on average for Dinosaur Park were the teeth of dinosaurs. And two specific ones that are most common is in the upper middle is a tooth called, for a dinosaur called Priconodon. And to the upper right is a reconstruction of Priconodon. It was an armored vegetarian dinosaur, kind of like the dinosaur version of a spiky hippopotamus. And we do have evidence of adult animals and juveniles that come from our park, primarily again from just isolated teeth.
JP, how big would this animal, this dinosaur, have been roughly?
I was just about to say that. Priconodon, being our most common dinosaur we find there, based on the estimates we made from the teeth alone, we hypothesize it being approximately 30 feet at the most.
Well,
so that's pretty big, yes. So this was actually even a giant for its type of dinosaur it is. So these are also known as ankylosaurs. Most ankylosaurs rarely get over 18 to 20 feet across the globe, but ours had particular evidence to saying this one was fairly large, you know, ridiculously large. And then in the lower middle is a tooth of what we call a raptor. You know, if anybody has ever seen the Jurassic Park film series, there are the villainous velociraptors that are frequented in the films, and ours is a relative. In fact, it was actually the primary inspiration for the large raptors in the films, a dinosaur called Deinonychus, and that dinosaur name translates to actually terrible claw. And rolling back to Priconodon, that name translates to essentially sawtooth pinecone tooth. Which is a very weird name that was developed back in the 1800s. But anyway, so we do find teeth of raptorial dinosaurs quite often in our park as well. So between the two, those are our most common dinosaur fossils. And we've been getting bits and pieces of other things. We get lots of crocodile teeth, which actually is the most common animal fossil we find. We get fragments of turtles and things like that. And every once in a while, we get some decent, you know, shaped dinosaur bones. For example, over the years, we've been able to put together a dinosaur foot. So this is the foot of an ostrich-like dinosaur, which we call ornithomimoid. It does not have an official scientific genus yet. It's actually going through a revamp right now by one of our colleagues. And but these ostrich-like dinosaurs again kind of lends the evidence that, you know, birds are dinosaurs, or birds derived from dinosaurs. Again, this is a very bird-looking type foot. The ornithomimoids, the ostrich-like dinosaurs, they were toothless primarily, and they had beaks, but they had arms that were covered in feathers, but they had claws at the end of their fingers, and they were flightless. They were basically the dinosaur version of a stork or flamingo, so probably wading through the ancient swamps and things like that used to be Maryland. And so we're quite excited about this foot. In fact, if any of you ever have spare time, if you want to see this fossil on display, it is currently on display at the Laurel Historical Museum in downtown Laurel. And it's part of a year-long display kind of highlighting some of the interesting stories about Laurel's connection with all the major counties in Maryland. And we are highlighted as being a major story inside Maryland. So, but
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
well, I was just going to say, but if you've seen the news recently, we've just made an important announcement. For the last 3 years, we've actually been kind of sitting on an important discovery, or actually working on an important discovery. We've actually now have much larger fossils that are actually clustered together. So this is what we call a bone bed. It's a kind of a paleontological term used for basically if you have an association of one or more bones of either one or more species of animal gathered together in its concentration, it was dubbed as a bone bed. And within the last few years, so we started excavating was essentially a large rock of ironstone that it had some bone exposed to it. And we started basically working on getting this rock exposed and, dug out and returned to our lab to be prepared and identified. And what it turned out to be is, as we were excavating this rock out, the rock was 5 feet long, and then it had a 4-foot long bone inside of it. But behind that rock were more bones. And over the last course of years, we started finding more fragments, and it was not within, I would say, the last few months that it really has snowballed. All the pictures you're seeing here are within since April to about the end of May, actually. And we're finding some more stuff. But the picture on the left is a 3-foot long shin bone to a giant meat-eating dinosaur that was T-Rex size, but it was, again, 50 million years before Tyrannosaurus rex. So we think it belongs to a predatory dinosaur called Acrocanthosaurus. The middle picture is a vertebra. It may be actually one of the first major bones of our armored dinosaur, Priconodon. So it's actually from the base of the tail. And then what I'm holding in my hand on the right there is a mystery bone. So we have some large mystery bones as well that we are now preparing in the lab to help us identify it. And just to kind of quick things, as a paleontologist, we usually work with fossils to help basically paint pictures. This is our official mural of what Dinosaur Park used to look like, again, 115 million years ago. And it was pretty much an ancient river estuary system that that basically flowed into the ancient Atlantic Ocean. A good modern analog would be if you ever visit the Patuxent River Park in southern Prince George's County. That environment is almost spot on to what the conditions were like at Dinosaur Park back, all those millions of years. But it shows, there's life in the waters and life on the lands. Again, the most dominant thing you see in the picture are not really the dinosaurs, but the trees. But there's a reconstruction on the left there of our giant meat-eating dinosaur, Acrocanthosaurus, and amongst all the other kind of cool critters that we have. I will point out that Maryland is one of the few states in the entire United States that actually has what we call a state dinosaur. Much like there's a state bird or a state flower, our state dinosaur is a massive long-necked dinosaur called Astrodon johnsoni, which was originally described in 1859 based on 2 teeth that were found possibly at the area which is now our park.
So we could effectively run over to our wonderful county council and see if they're interested in making your new find the county dinosaur.
Well, I would almost pick out one of the other dinosaurs as a county dinosaur in a way, unless we come with something of like a brand new species. Because Astrodon, is kind of the star of our park, but we do have some really cool other species of animals that would probably be worth a designation to that matter. So
let me ask you, so it's a dinosaur park, and is your lab on the park, or is that do you take these finds someplace and do the science someplace else?
We do the science somewhere else. So we actually, as part of the archaeology office with the Maryland National Capital Parks and Planning Commission, I'm subset into that office, and so our lab facility is there. And all our fossils are basically taken from the park, secured in our office/lab to be cleaned, prepared, and curated for future generations.
Well, can you tell us a little more about the park itself then? And I have visited it once. I have to say, with my my vision as it is, I had very excited little people who were fossil hunting, explaining what I should be looking at. But can you tell us a little bit, if you're a visitor, about the
Yeah,
park,
so
what's
that
there?
kind of brings up my last slide as a plug to our programming. So if you come to visit Dinosaur Park, just say on what we consider an off day, any day of the week, 7 days a week, the park is open from the sunrise to sunset. However, the fossil site itself is only accessible during our free public programs or during our private programs. So the free public programs are every first and third Saturdays of each month for a 4-hour period. For example, August 5th is our next program from 10 to 2. And people are welcome to come in during that time. There's an orientation where we kind of give a brief show and tell about the kinds of fossils and the types of dinosaurs that people will encounter. And then after going over the rules of the park, then we kind of invite our visitors to come out and kind of spread out and look over the surface. So what's fantastic about Dinosaur Park compared to other fossil sites that I've worked on, it's Mother Nature does a lot of the work for us. With the bedrock being primarily clay, every time it rains, and we had some pretty good storms the last few days, it washes away the clay, leaving behind the fossils for us to look for and pick up. And 80% of the job of a paleontologist is basically wandering around hillsides and essentially picking up fossils. People always get this kind of false sense of that, paleontologists go out to a spot, they know there's gonna be fossil, and they just randomly start digging, and they're gonna find stuff, and that never works that way. There's lots of man hours of people just searching before they can find that hot spot that's a good place to dig. And essentially, the rule of thumb is that if you see a bone or any other kind of fossil going into the hillside, that's when you sit down and actually do the physical work of uncovering it more, quote unquote, digging, to see how much is there. And depending on how much is there is like how extensive your dig is going to be. So usually, kind of like that dinosaur foot that I showed earlier, those were pieces that we kind of found individually throughout the park. And that was kind of what we were used to until we recognized that we had this bone bed, this year. And that's been like the more extensive, textbook excavation of a dinosaur site in that, there's multiple bones after bone after bone going into a hillside, and you have to dig back the hill more to reveal more. But anyway, getting back to our program, so we have free programs every first and third Saturday for the public to come into. Then we also offer private educational programs, which are good for field trips for all ages. And then we also now offer a dig experience program where people, for smaller groups, you can come in and at least work with us for 3 hours and in our bone bed and help us uncover more. And I say at least 3 hours because by the time 3 hours are done, a lot of times, you can get tired moving that much large amounts of sediment in 3 hours. But we will go longer if you're interested. And then we also offer free school visits for our program where we bring elements of the park to schools around the county. But I do want to point out real quick, we are now technically full for the rest of the year for 2023. So we are taking reservations for 2024. So if this organization would love to come out and dig with us, please let me know, and maybe we can arrange something for next year.
I want to go, well, thank you very much for letting our listeners and our society know about the options there. I want to go back to a little technical question. So you mentioned a bone bed, and if I understood correctly, this is an area in which you find many different fossils or remains of different animals. Do I understand this correct?
It doesn't necessarily have to be different species. There are some places like there's a place called Dinosaur Provincial Park, which is in Alberta, Canada. And they do have multiple bone bed horizons throughout the entirety of the park. And some of these bone beds are just thousands upon thousands of bones of one species of dinosaur. Some of them are like horned dinosaurs. They're kind of like the rhino versions of dinosaurs. And there's some what we call duck-billed dinosaurs, big, large, billed plant-eating animals. And they're just scores of just one species. They probably were caught up in maybe a flash flood or some sort of extreme event, but whatever happened, they got all kind of buried and captured in one place.
You just answered my question. What's the hypothesis for this concentration, whether it's one or two species or multiple species?
So in our case for Dinosaur Park, the site again being a river, it's slow moving, kind of like what you see in Patuxent River Park. From what I can tell, just from looking at how the bones are laid out right now, everything is kind of concentrated because they're getting caught up into a log jam. There's lots and lots of wood in amongst all the bones that we're finding. So we're thinking what probably happened is that some things probably died on the banks, and then their remains got washed up into the river, and they got caught up in basically this jam of wood, and then they got buried over. Because we have yet come across anything that's articulated. So basically, bone attaching bone properly in the anatomical sequence. Most of these bones are kind of spread up and jumbled around. The way I like to think of it, they're a mixed bag of nuts. In terms of like all the different kinds of species and things that we're seeing. And in terms of the species that we're seeing, so far we've identified at least 7 different species of dinosaurs within our bone bed. And this is a small area. I mean, it's not relatively huge at all. So it's cool to have this kind of interesting concentration of species in one spot. But we're kind of curious like how many more parts to one individual we're going to find. But anyway, so we have 2 plant-eating dinosaurs. So we have something that looks like Astrodon, our state dinosaur. We have a few parts of that. We have our large armored plant-eating dinosaur. We have the shin bone to our giant meat-eating dinosaur. We have isolated teeth of 2 meat-eating dinosaurs. So we have a tooth of the raptorial dinosaur Deinonychus, and then we have a tooth of a early relative to Tyrannosaurus rex, actually. So this is actually one of Maryland's first fossil evidence of a tyrannosaur for the entirety of the state, which is pretty exciting. And then we have a little thigh bone of a dinosaur about the size of a chicken, which we call Chickensaurus. It's literally the thigh size that you get in your chicken dinner. So that's kind of a fun specimen. And then we have 4 other types of creatures we find in the dig area. So lots of turtle shell fragments have been found so far. Some isolated teeth of crocodiles. We have the tail barb to North America's oldest stingray fossil from our site, which was, for me studying fish, that's really cool. And then we have clams. So clams were getting kind of caught up in some of this stuff too. They probably were there, and they got buried over with everything. They're probably just doing their clamming lifestyles when they got caught up with all this.
I think you mentioned that this was probably a tributary to a larger body of water. Can I say ocean, or we don't really know?
It was not far from the ancient Atlantic coast. So over time, so at the time of Dinosaur Park, the Atlantic coast was much closer. How close, I can't give you an actual, mileage or distance type thing. But just judging from the kinds of creatures we find, it couldn't be too far off. One of the key things we do find are the remains of shark's teeth and some other shark parts. And those sharks represent a species that is only known as adults in marine waters. We found body fossils of these sharks of the same species, basically from marine deposits in England. But the ones we have are juveniles, and they are upstream in freshwater deposits. Because what we have is, again, the clams and the snails are what gives us the evidence that this is freshwater. So the hypothesis goes is that the adult sharks are coming up the stream, laying their egg cases, and then they're going back out to the ocean to live the rest of their lives. And then the juveniles will hatch from their eggs and then live part of their lives in the river system. And then as they mature, then they will go back out to sea again. So maybe it's not going to be thinking about distances of like Mississippi, so you have the Louisiana river system. Sharks are not swimming all the way up to like St. Louis. I think it's actually a little bit closer than that, because you want to be at least a little closer to home before you, if you want to hatch out and live your life.
So I never thought of sharks and salmon in the same
surprisingly, when you look at the lifestyles of sharks, they do salmon-y type things. Now, the difference is that a shark will lay its eggs and then go back out to sea and live much longer. Salmon, right, when you go and lay their eggs, they die and then they're done. So that's the one of the key differences there. So
I have another I guess a hypothetical question. So we have this unique site just outside of Laurel. And if I understood the history, you told me a little bit of this is luck based on human activity, not a search for science and dinosaurs, but for mineral resource. And then voila, all of a sudden they're dinosaurs, and the county or Maryland National Capital Park and Planning said, aha, we need to save this. How come we don't have more of these sites with all this digging, excavating, earth moving?
So that gets into the realm of land management. So again, much of the history of what the area what Dinosaur Park is now, it was privately owned. It was basically a business. They were concerned was business. The original landowners were at least generous enough to allow fossil collectors to come in occasionally, as long as they weren't getting in the way of machinery and activities and things like that. And there's a lot of fossil sites across the country and even the globe where they have similar operations, where fossil collectors would come in to places where they were actively excavating for economic purposes, and people will collect things. And that's kind of been the story of our area for quite a while. So that's probably one of the big reasons why not a lot of bone beds were found. So the very first bone bed actually goes back to 1887. And that story goes is that so after the first initial fossils were discovered in the late 1850s, and partially described in the mid 1860s, not much else was found until the United States Geological Survey started getting started. And so the headquarters again is in Washington, D.C. And when it was getting started, the head of the USGS, which was John Wesley Powell, who was famous for climbing the Grand Canyon, had a friend who was a paleontologist named Othniel Charles Marsh, who started his own museum with his rich uncle's financing, essentially. He started a museum in Yale, which is now the Peabody Museum, and his main goal was to fill it with fossils. And so because Marsh knew people in the government and Powell knew Marsh through that connection, he asked Marsh to say, hey, could you send down an associate to come down and kind of help us understand some of the ages here? We hear rumors of dinosaur fossils being found outside of Washington, D.C. Can you help put a finger on what the age is and what kind of things are we finding? So that's what Marsh did. He sent another paleontologist by the name of John Bell Hatcher in the winter of 1887. And he spent a couple months basically in Prince George's County, starting from the southern end of the county and working his way north. And originally Hatcher was finding younger fossils through the southern part of our county. And then it wasn't until he got into near the Laurel area that he was tipped off that, oh yeah, we're finding some plant fossils near our iron mines. Would you want to come check it out? And so he did, and were able to identify dinosaur bones out of there. And one of those bone beds is what led to one of the first kind of major partial skeletons of a dinosaur to be found basically in the eastern seaboard.
Wow. See,
Yeah.
that's history that we can identify with. That's right up our alley. I have a question that has to do with paleontology, but you may not know the answer. I read a book on quantum mechanics recently, and you're going to love this, that mentioned the godmother of paleontology was an English woman.
Yes.
Do you know a little bit of her story? I think our listeners will.
Mary Anning, yes, she is the godmother of paleontology, essentially. This would maybe consider modern paleontology. She was a commoner by English standards. She supported herself by collecting fossils in the Lyme Regis region of England. And Lyme Regis is essentially marine fossil beds that are full of coiled cephalopod or octopi relatives called ammonites. And she also found some of the first major skeletons of ancient marine reptiles, and including things called ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs. And so when she discovered these basically articulated skeletons, she sold her wares to essentially gentlemen scientists, which is pretty much what they were, Our early paleontology ancestors were people who had money, who were able to sit on their butts and talk about fossils, essentially. Anyway, she sold those fossils to these paleontologists, and a lot of her fossils wound up being in the British Museum eventually. But for the most part of her life, she was kind of unsung by most of her peers, because again, she was a woman, she was a commoner. It was only a few occasions where they, near the end of her life, would realize, oh, she actually had made some serious contributions, and gave her recognition with the I think it was essentially the Geologic Society of that time.
Yeah,
So,
I believe she's early 19th century, or the
yeah,
first
like,
half of the 19th century.
yeah, like want to say like early 1800s.
Yeah, right,
I can't
right,
remember.
right.
I can't remember exactly when she passed. But the people of the Lyme Regis region has recently like made a monument to her. So they actually have her what she typically wore, and she had a terrier dog, I believe, who was always her constant companion, and they basically have her life-size statue, kind of like if she's off to go off and collect the next set of fossils to sell. So, and it's a region that still allows people to go out there and collect fossils to this day. In fact, though, that particular marine shark that I was talking about, she actually found one of the first. So it's one of her species.
Well, you never know what you get when you're reading a book on quantum
On
mechanics.
mechanic, yeah.
Yeah.
There's some better books about her life. Of course, I can't remember the titles and authors, but definitely Google Mary Anning if you get a chance. And there's also new book that just came out not too long ago on John Bell Hatcher, and it talks about his life, and he was kind of a cowboy in a way, in terms of like going looking for fossils at certain sites, and he talks about his time in Prince George's County looking for fossils for marsh. So
When he was here in Prince George's, you said he worked his way up from the South County. I'm presuming that he didn't crisscross between, well, you may not know this, between the Potomac and Patuxent. Did he just sort of go up the Patuxent Valley, or do you have any idea?
He kind of, if I remember correctly from what it was described, the Bladensburg area, like he worked south of the Bladensburg area and then moved northward. And so what he was finding in the southern region, and a lot of our local fossil collectors know these beds really well. So they were finding things that are, well, Megalodon, the shark, that's the giant shark from the Miocene period. So it's roughly a 14 million year old shark, with massive teeth. And there's a new movie coming out this week, sequel to another weird sci-fi film, but it's a giant megalodon is the villain in this film, I guess. Anyway, so he's finding fossils like that. He found some whale fossils. He found some other odds and ends, even going a little bit older. Things dating there just right after the age of the dinosaurs. So some early sharks and some other interesting marine creatures. And then as he was working northward, that's when he was starting to get some clues. He was talking to the mining operation around Merkirk. Yes, Merkirk is typically the historic name for a lot of these fossil beds. And essentially where Dinosaur Park is just near the northern border of where Merkirk used to be. In fact, actually one of our sites that's within the commission is called Blue Ponds. It was actually part of that Merkirk area. So
you're raising, I have so many questions now all of a sudden. So we have this formally protected several acre site, but if people know what they're looking for and they understand they can't just go trespassing on private property, there are dinosaur or fossils all over the place if the erosion has happened.
So in terms of our state of Maryland, I would argue that Prince George's County has one of the most diverse fossil records for the entirety of the state. People usually, when they think of fossils in Maryland, they think of Calvert County because that's where the Calvert Cliffs are. But the diversity that's usually in Calvert County is not as great, at least in my opinion, compared to Prince George's County, because we have some of the older rocks that contain the dinosaurs. But most of what Calvert has is younger rocks, and that's a lot of marine beds and stuff like that. If you go towards the Panhandle, then you can get into some fossils that are way older, much, much more older than any dinosaur that's ever existed. And you'll find some really cool organisms that go way back in the past. Things we call trilobites, which are kind of, they look like pill bugs, or what we also call roly-polies if you pull back leaf litter and things like that. There's an ancient
when you say way older, so what's
we're talking
older than 200 million years?
So we're talking about getting into like, you know, the 400 million year range, and then going younger from there. So yeah, so there's some really cool stuff that can be found up in the Appalachia part of the state.
The Dinosaur Park that you're at in Laurel, that's the only official dinosaur park in Prince George's County?
It's the only official dinosaur park in the entire state of Maryland, in terms of being an official fossil site. I do believe there are a couple dinosaur park-esque places with like dinosaur statuary and things like that, in and around Virginia, and I think also in Pennsylvania. But in terms of as a fossil site that's dinosaur dominant, we're it. There's one other site that is north in New Jersey that's going to be opening soon, called the Elderman fossil site. And what it is that they have rocks that are much younger than what we have at Dinosaur Park, but they are marine beds, but they've been finding some really complete creatures that used to be living around the ocean. Things like what we call mosasaurs. Mosasaurs are giant marine reptiles that are basically distant relatives to Komodo dragons. Basically, think of a Komodo dragon decided to grow flippers and get really, really big. If anybody's ever seen the first Jurassic World movie, it was the part of the new series. It's the giant reptile that comes up and snaps on the shark and then dives back down in this giant like SeaWorld-esque pool. And fun fact is we have that in Prince George's County. Up and around the Oxon Hill area, there's scores of these things.
Yeah. So let me understand this. If you know what you're looking for, if you've gotten the landowner's permission, and I want to stress that in case we have anybody thinking you do need landowner permission to go trampling.
Absolutely.
But if you know what you're looking for, you might find a fossil or two in Prince George's County besides me.
Oh yeah, there's a number of places up and around the entirety of our county that are just full of fossils. In the case of the Maryland National Capital Parks and Planning Commission, there's a number of areas that are not official fossil sites, but they have fossils. In terms of like a public site, you know, but there are commission properties that have quite an extensive fossil record.
And have you all started in officially looking into those sites?
Not yet. It's based on.
But you're telling us you have work.
There's lots of work to be done if given the right incentives. So.
Excellent. You said that you find, when I was there with the small group of children, they get to go on this sort of slopey surface, and if I remember, they're allowed to. There was something, if you find this, that's, I guess, the lignite or something, you can keep that. But if you find a dinosaur head, you can't keep that.
Yes, absolutely. You cannot keep the dinosaur head if you found it. But you will get full credit. So if little Sally found, you know, like the best Acrocanthosaurus skull ever, will probably nickname the skull after Sally. And she'll put her name with that specimen, but we are going to hold on to it as public trust. We will clean it, prepare it, and hopefully, you know, Sally can come back and take a picture of herself with the clean fossil. But we are going to hold on to it for future generations, for both research and discovery.
For me, the little group I was with, everybody came home a winner, even if they couldn't quite identify what they found.
And most of the time, I mean, there's, like I said, there's scores of other fossils, plant fossils being the most dominant, that, you know, we encourage, you know, people are allowed to take at least one sample home of either the ironstone with plant fossils on it or the lignitized wood, as another example. And of course, we're not talking like huge chunks of rock, you know, like this big. We're talking, you know, hand of the palm size type specimens. Because I've had kids trying to take out like a massive rock one time, and you have to tell them stop, no, leave it there, that kind of thing.
Yes, well, kids will be kids.
Kids will be kids, and then there's also parents who will be parents too, so who were just like, oh, I'm gonna take this.
Yes, well, some kids are bigger than others.
Yeah, exactly. Fun story about that is that more often than not, the parents will take their kids there, but it's the parents who want to stick around longer than the children. So, because the parents are getting a lot more fun in searching around compared to the kids. Because unfortunately, kids like to think there's going to be like huge scores of bones they're going to look at and pick at, and that's not the case. You do have to be patient. You're not going to always find something right off the bat, at least not important things. And what we usually encourage people to do is come out, visit us as multiple times as they can, and develop what we call a search image. Search image is what you train your eye to look for in a fossil site, to kind of hone in what's not the usual things you usually see when you look on the surface of the hillside. You'll see a lot of gray clay, you'll see a lot of orange rocks, you'll see a lot of black lignite, but what we're looking for is the different colored things. Bones, when they actually expose to the air for a short amount of time, they can start changing color. So they start off kind of a nice dark chocolate brown color in their natural state. But if they get exposed to the elements for a little bit, they'll start changing almost to a bluish color.
Dinosaurs roamed the earth, being poetic, and then something happened. And then, except for the birds, they gave way to mammals. Do I understand this correctly? Said the plant kind.
So yeah, there's a lot of major events that occur to kind of like slowly wiped out the dinosaurs. Again, so being at that 115 million years, we're quote unquote near the early Cretaceous period. We're at the beginning of the end of the age of the dinosaurs. A lot of environmental factors are happening at that time. So 115 million years ago, there was actually a seaway that was starting to develop that bisected our continent in half. And when that actually fully occurred, it actually basically isolated dinosaur populations. So the stuff on the east evolved differently compared to the stuff on the west in terms of species. And they also gained with other creatures too, the other plants and animals. So there's very distinct faunas. But then right about the time when the last major extinction event that wiped up the giant dinosaurs occurred, that seaway drained and things were starting to mingle again. Whether that led to our continent having the major extinction event, probably not. But what did happen approximately 66 million years ago is that there was a large, essentially meteorite that hit the planet around the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. And that impact was essentially blew up a lot of gases and materials in the air. There's, the idea that these gases went up into the atmosphere, covered the planet, caused kind of a snowball effect where it got rapidly cool and things could not grow. Because there was no sunlight for number of years, and so things slowly died out that way. There's also further evidence that this is also the same time when India was colliding into mainland Asia, forming the Himalayas, and that produced a lot of volcanic ash into the air. And so they're thinking it may have been a 1-2 punch. Already the dinosaurs were suffering from just localized environmental change, with ash going into the air and kind of changing the overall global temperatures. And then the asteroid hit, and then it really kind of was the quote unquote death nail for all the big dinosaurs.
So somewhere around 60 to 70 million years is in a fuzzy, not specific. That's kind of the end of the reign of dinosaurs, more or less.
They've pinpointed to be at 66 million years. There was a lot of geologists and even a physicist got involved and kind of like really pinpointed that age date. So 66 is the cutoff. And then after 66, so when you get into 65 and beyond, getting those numbers much younger, you don't see dinosaurs anymore except for the birds, but you do see the recovery of that, and we actually have part of that preserved in Maryland of that story. So there's a site that actually is right next to where the Washington football team plays. That's called the Bright Seat Formation, and the Bright Seat Formation the type section is basically it's a point of land that basically it's designated as the descriptor point for all like this one geologic unit, and it's actually that type section is right there, right next to the parking lot, and it was actually preserved as part of the development of that area. But anyway, right there it records exactly the first million or so years right after that extinction event, and you can actually see where there are some holdovers from that extinction event that just kind of barely held on for a little bit, and then poof, they're gone. These are the ammonites, the little coiled octopi relatives. And then you also see things like the sharks. Again, I'm a shark guy, and there's some really cool things. There's some sharks that barely survived the end of the age of the dinosaurs, and then give it another couple million years, and they're completely gone. They could not compete with some of the other new sharks and decided, ooh, hey, there's an opening for me for here now, so I'll take off. And that led to things like great white sharks and megalodon. So
this is very cool. This is another historic Prince George's site that the Historic Preservation Commission doesn't know anything about. So let me back up a little bit. You said an ocean bisected. I'm assuming this is what we now call the Mississippi, Missouri, the Great Plains. That's where this ocean was.
Yeah, we call it the Great Interior Seaway for that time period, and a lot of cool fossils have been found in there, especially around the Kansas, Nebraska. From being, I'm actually originally from the West, so actually places like Utah and northern Arizona had the other shore line of the seaway, and there was a lot of cool creatures that were found that represented the seaway. Big fish, big reptiles that lived in the waters are kind of like the whale equivalents of what we see today. And of course, there was also coastal dinosaurs that were found. So,
as a student of human history, I've been asking you these date things for a human history. Human history, recorded history, isn't that old. Writing is a few seconds ago shows up. When does, this is maybe out of your wheelhouse, but when do Homo sapiens, when do we sort of have a fossil record? Do you know offhand, to the nearest 100,000 years?
For true humans, you're asking?
Homo sapiens, or I guess Homo erectus came before us.
So for our genus Homo, it goes back, I want to say, and it's been a while since I've actually looked up into this, somewhere between 2, maybe 1.5 million is the first Homo genus.
Mm-hmm.
And but for our own species, yeah, I would say about 150,000 to 100,000 years ago is when true modern humans were really kind of like more recognized in the fossil record.
Hopefully they're note students writing our notes down. I'm trying to give a context to myself and to listeners of a time scale that we probably have to make logarithmic to get on a sheet of paper. Because it's so huge.
Yeah, we as a species, in terms of the fossil, all of the fossil record is a blink of an eye, or maybe even not even that fast. It was probably, half blink, because we haven't been around that long. But look at the impact we've already made in terms of just everything, and so we've accomplished a lot in that 100,000 years, I would say. But compared to everything else on the planet, we're still neophytes in a way.
Let me. I wish I could write all my notes down. You said that you have a lot of. I'm going to go plants now because that's something I'm more comfortable with. Do the plant fossils, you're able to put them in taxonomic groups? Or
yeah. So the dominant fossil types we find in terms of plants at Dinosaur Park are conifers, specifically redwood and cypress. So those type of plants, so we still find cypress in our state to this day, but redwoods are no longer here. They only exist mostly in the Northwest now. And but we do find wood. Actually, we're doing a study right now. One of my volunteers is actually looking into the diversity of our pine cones. So pine cones is a common plant fossil we find, and it's one of those kind of rare plant fossils that we hold on to if somebody finds one, because we're doing this study. But you can get a lot of diversity information if you basically count and measure your pine cones. And it turns out that there is a dominant species, as I would say is something, I think we figured out was like 85% of our cones are one type. But then we have 4 to 5 other species of conifers by the other kinds of cones we come across. So now the question I'm asking myself now, after we did kind of this quick survey, is this indicative because we are spotting this particular cone more often just because it's a collection bias, or is there an actual kind of phenomenon where one type of tree was more dominant than the others? But we do find some really cool other plants. There's evidence of horsetails, ferns, some of the other fossil sites that are not far from the park that actually preserve, more plant material in their entirety. There's some ginkgo relatives that are from our region.
Oh, you just answered my question. Okay.
Well, I got one more. This is actually really cool about the history of at least the rocks that we study. The rocks that make up Dinosaur Park, they were some of the first evidence by pollens to show flowering plants going back 115 million years. Now, we do know that there are now older flowering plants, but for the longest time, the rocks that make up Dinosaur Park were the benchmark of like, yeah, this is where flowering plants started, and then they took off after this point.
Are you able to, based on the botanical and the record of other life forms, the weather, the climate, what would you describe the climate as, your best guess?
Definitely a little bit more warmer, definitely a little bit more humid. A lot of times, people like to throw around the analogy of going down to Florida.
Okay.
One of the things we're kind of starting right now, so we just had a team from the University of Kansas come in, and they collected sediment and mineral samples to kind of also do some chemistry to kind of help us tell us the climate story. And considering our timeline, again, roughly kind of 115 million years ago, there was actually a cooling snap right about that time frame, and was suggesting there was a cool period. So there was a drying out period roughly about the time when the park was, was being deposited, essentially. So that it may have been a little bit drier than we previously thought. So we still have a lot more work to do. So yeah, stay tuned. We might have some more information that might tell a more vivid story.
Well, I think that's a great place to stop. Sorry, John Peter. We don't have any questions, and a couple of questions I did have you guys answered. So I'm going to say thank you very much to JP and John Peter for our chat tonight.
Thank you so much for this. I learned so much.
And I want to thank our audience for joining us this evening. And just a reminder, our next history chat will be on Monday, August 28th, and we'll be talking to a colleague of JP's, Ed Day, and he's going to talk about several of our historic sites, particularly Compton Bassett and the work that they're doing there at that site. Oh, whoops. So Stacy Hawkins just says, thank you so much, JP and John Peter. Awesome. And congratulations on your great finds.
Yeah, thank you, Stacy.
So on that note, thank you everybody for joining us, and have a nice evening.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.